Billions of people around the world live in extreme poverty. Almost 1 in 10 people around the world live below the international poverty line. This is 689 million people struggling to survive for less than $1.90 a day, and nearly 2 billion people, or 26.2% of the world's population, live on less than $3.20 a day.
Corruption increases income inequality and poverty through slowing economic growth. Corruption causes misallocation of resources and impedes investment, innovation, entrepreneurship, growth, and productivity. At the same time, the rate of corruption varies from country to country. A biased tax system that favors rich and well-connected, poor targeting of social programs, use of wealth by the well-to-do to lobby government for favorable policies that perpetuate inequality in asset ownership.
Technology also plays a huge role in the increase in inequality. Due to advancement in technology, less skilled jobs are being taken away by robots, which leaves a lot of less skilled people unemployed. In our modern world, the reliance on technology is increasing day by day. More and more jobs are becoming technology reliant. The poor might not be able to do those jobs as they don't have access and knowledge to understand futuristic devices. Poor countries don't have enough access to high-speed internet and IoT devices, while the rich countries have access to them, which is one of the main reasons for this.
In previous time, economists would be infatuated with culture in order to take over the wealth. Social theorists have advanced the relationship between the cultural characteristics of a society and resource distribution in its community. Standard research of inequality in income distribution has not paid attention to social organization and cultural contexts from which income distribution arises.
To get the understanding of the ethics of inequality is not a simple or small amount of someone's fortune that has been lost owing to poor luck. After all, one family background and the environment in which they live determine whether or not they have a strong work ethics. Inequality fears should be focused on the society safety net and focus more on the obstacle that the working poor face. On the other hand, governments in all nations can do more effort to decrease poverty and protect people in poverty from serious financial consequences of environmental damage. Environmental issues, on the other hand, increase the suffering of poor people. Poor people take the burden of environmental bad effects, whether they can be economic, social, or linked to mental or physical health. Population growth in the poor country is causing harm to a great number of local environmental resources, including fresh water, trees, topsoil, making living even difficult for the poorest of people. According to the study, it claims that wealthier countries having a great deal of money. Individuals inside poor countries and private sector companies are all involved in a natural resource grab. The poorest 20% of the world population lack the resources to meet their basic needs, while they consume only 1.3% of global GDP.
The perception that few people are getting rich at the expense of rest of us is fueling the fear that the world is developing what one expert called a downtown AB economy, with a small wealthy class, the 1%, and the large class of the poor workers. Meanwhile, the middle class is being squeezed with the higher price and stagnant wages, forcing many to go into personal debt to try to keep up.
The Sustainable Development Goals (SDGs), also known as Global Goals, were adopted by the United Nations in 2015 as a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that by 2030. SDG 1. The SDG 1 on no poverty is a bold commitment to finish what we started and end poverty in all forms and dimensions by 2030. This involves targeting the most vulnerable, increasing basic resources and services. Eradicating poverty is not a task of charity, it is an act of justice and the key to unlocking an enormous human potential. Still, nearly half of the world's population lives in poverty. Some of the goals are, by 2030, reduce at least by half the proportion of men, women, and children of all ages living in poverty. By 2030, ensure that all men and women, in particular the poor and the vulnerable, have equal rights to economic resources as well as access to basic services, ownership and control over land and other forms of property, inheritance, natural resources, appropriate new technology and financial services, including microfinance.
Thank you for agreeing for the interview. Should I start the first question?
Yeah.
What can be done to narrow the gap between rich and poor?
One of the first ideas that comes to my mind is basically government providing more working spaces for the people to get employed and then getting the salary that they want. Another thing that they would do, probably they could tax people according to the salaries that they, or according to the incomes that they do. So basically people who get more payments or more incomes every month or every year will get taxed more than the people who get less.
What do you think about the inequality between rich and poor?
I think that is one of the unavoidable things. However, what do I think is that it's wrong and we shouldn't have that huge gap between rich and poor people. And everybody should have an equal access to the things, like basic things like education, medicine, and etc.
How do you think avoiding taxes affects income equality?
I would say it influences a lot because basically poor people cannot afford any taxes because they have everything transferred, while rich people and huge management companies may avoid taxes by doing some things, and especially like how can you say for like giving money for the charity and basically avoiding, because of the charity things, their taxes will be lowered, and but basically it doesn't change a lot of things because you never can check whether it really goes to charity or not.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
So the first question is, what do you think are the main causes of inequality between rich and
the main causes of it come from two areas. The first one is access to education. Those who have a level of wealth are able to access education. They can afford for their children to go to school from a young age all the way through education. Then go to university and then they will get jobs, and that increases the wealth of that family. Whereas those who unfortunately don't have that wealth sometimes have to take their children out of school at an early age, and it creates that cycle of poverty that family is in. So education is one of the things that causes inequality. And I would say the second thing is probably government policy. Governments tend to look at the biggest group and the smallest group are the richest group, and the governments often come from that group of people. So taxation tends to affect more people in the lower bands than it does in the top bands. So government policy sort of affects inequality.
has become harder for someone born with?
I think there is always possibilities for entrepreneurs and clever people and intellectual people with hard work and drive to bridge that gap. And also I think it depends where you're born, which society you were born in. So for example, in some European countries which have free education and free university, the opportunities are there for everybody, and people can bridge that gap for education. But whereas perhaps in the UK, Thailand, the US, where universities pay for, it's incredibly hard for families to reach that level.
And how do you think the financial gap is increasing over the years?
I think one thing we need to look at is what's happened in the last 2 years with the pandemic. Because what we see, if you look at some data, is that the richest people in the world have got richer through the pandemic. But what we've seen is the poorest people are the ones who have lost their jobs because, let's say, Thailand, the tourist industry is closed down, which doesn't just affect big hotels, but the cleaners in the hotel, the people who supply laundry to the hotel, the people who supply food to the hotel. These are at the poorer end of the scale. So what we've seen with the pandemic is the rich have been able to capitalise by selling NTK tests with their required PPE equipment. And they've done very well at it, whereas a lot of the poor people have lost their work. So this is again that inequality.
Thank you very much for the input.
Thank you.
Good morning. We would like to introduce to you about poverty and inequality. Since you're from Uganda, as one of the first countries, we would like to ask us the living condition there.
Thank you so much for the interview. Apparently, the living condition or situation in Uganda is below standard, as much of the young population lives below the poverty line. Given that it has one of the most youngest populations in the world, we face a lot of unemployment, and that's the reason the living situation or the standard of living is quite very, very low and below average.
Okay. So due to the COVID pandemic, how does it affects the financial situation? How does it feel?
Because so many companies closed down, very many young people and some few older people in the business fraternity lost their jobs. Many companies closed. Multinational companies that were so foreign were also closed because of the pandemic and constant lockdowns. And therefore, the financial situation is at worst because of no employment. In regard to the employed people, take an example in schools. Schools were closed now for 2 years. Schools have been closed, and that means there are so many the corporate world or the employed people that are not earning from their professions. So generally, it's very poor.
Since you said that there's very less, a lot of unemployment people, businesses are going down. So it's like, you think it will be possible to decrease the gap between the rich and the poor, and how can the inequality be decreased?
Thank you so much. I think from my perspective, it's very hard to decrease that inequality because, like I said, much of the youths below the age of 30 are unemployed, and the people above 40 or between 30 and 40 are the ones in better jobs, and that means it's really difficult, irrespective of the education and the education status of those who are young. And also, like I say, the population consists mostly of young people. So it's difficult to close or decrease the gap between the rich and the poor. So, not easy to decrease the inequality. However, if it's to be decreased, there's need to empower the young population.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you too.